Welcome back to Locked on Buffs. It's me, Kevin Borba, and Dalton Wasserman of PFF. Dalton, we're talking about Colorado, and I think there's sort of this notion around them that they can't compete because they've been bad. They can't compete because they were subpar last year, right? But they've made a lot of changes. They've added a lot of experience. They've added a lot of talent. We just talked about it in the first segment. Where do you sort of see them in the hierarchy of the Big 12? Are they a mid Big 12 team, like mid-tier? Are they towards the top or towards the bottom? Because I think most preseason polls have them, there's 16 teams now. I think most preseason polls have them around 10, 11.
Yeah, I would have them higher than that. I think there are legitimately 8 or 9 teams in the Big 12 that could contend. It's a very wide open conference. There's some teams that lean more towards the top. I think Arizona is obviously really, really good. Oklahoma State was in the Big 12 title game last year. There's a lot of hype on Utah. I believe they're the betting favorite to win the conference, but I wouldn't have Colorado 10th or 11th. I think they have a lot of talent at the skill positions. They have elite talent, man. I mean, when you talk about Shedeur and Travis Hunter and BJ Green and some of the other guys that they have on this team, I don't think they're the 11th best team in the conference. I think they're better than that. They are certainly in the top. They're certainly in the top half. They're possibly in the top 5. And honestly, if they're better in the trenches than they were last year, I think they could contend. Look, when you have one of the 3 or 4 best quarterbacks in the country, you are supposed to contend for your conference title. You're supposed to contend for a playoff spot, right? In a 12-team playoff. I think they very well could. They have to execute better in the trenches. It's a fact. If this offensive line gels, Colorado may be the biggest X factor in the conference, because we know between Shedeur, I would say, and Noah Fafita, these are pretty clearly the 2 best quarterbacks in the Big 12. And that's a huge advantage to have. If you have one of the 2 best quarterbacks in your conference, you're at a massive, massive advantage over everybody else, regardless of some of your other flaws, right? So I think there's certainly if I was making a group of 8 or 9 teams, which I think there are, that would contend for a Big 12 title, Colorado's absolutely in that mix.
Okay, so Colorado's in that mix. So let's say it's October, it's November. I feel like that's when things start really getting intense in the Big 12 championship race. For Colorado to sort of stay in that mix, because obviously their schedule, for those who don't know, I'll read it to you real quick. North Dakota State, at Nebraska, at Colorado State. They host Baylor. They travel to UCF that's their first 5 games. Bye week, Kansas State, at Arizona. And this is October. Kansas State, Arizona, who are both probably going to be top 25 teams. Cincinnati's kind of I would say a week off, but in the Big 12, there's really no weeks off. Then they have a bye week again. Then they finish with Texas Tech, Utah, Kansas, Oklahoma State. So in that October to November range, what do you think an ideal sort of, I guess, couple weeks looks like? Because that's when it comes down to their season. Like, that's what their season comes down to, in my opinion. How they finish in those last we'll call it 6 games or 7 games. How they do in those? I think they have to go to contend at least 5-2, and that's a tough draw right there.
Well, I think your ideal goal for the season really is to go 10-2, right? Last year, if you had a 12-team playoff, there's only one team, I believe it was Oklahoma, that won 10 games and would have missed the playoffs. So 10 games, I think, is really your hard cutoff. Maybe you could argue a 9-3 through that stretch. I think the biggest thing, it's going to be more of a feel thing than an actual record thing, or which teams. There's going to be a ton of the tie-breaking scenarios and all of that stuff in the Big 12.
It's going to be a disaster.
It's going to be a disaster. It's so wide open. It's going to come into play. The bigger thing for me, those last 4 that you mentioned, I think it was Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Kansas, and one other one, is Oklahoma State, going into those last 4. We're going to know how it's going to go by how good their run defense is. If their run defense through 8 games looks like a solid unit and they fixed it, and all these D linemen and Jalen Wester and some of these guys, like, they come in and solidify this run defense, that's the key to beating all of those teams, even a Texas Tech. I think Colorado's better than Texas Tech. But Texas Tech has Taj Brooks, who could ruin your night. Absolutely. Even an earlier season game like UCF, we had UCF as the number 2 running back unit in the country when we did top 10 units. Oof. That's a dangerous, dangerous team to be playing. Even if you think all around Colorado's better, when you have teams that can run the ball and control the game, and obviously I don't have to mention what Oklahoma State and what Ollie Gordon can do. I mean, you're talking about the best back in the country. Right. That's what it's going to come down to for me. The record and the exact number of wins and losses, we'll probably get into scenarios and college football playoff rankings as we get there. To me, it's more, especially it was UCF and who right after it?
UCF, and then they have Kansas State and Arizona right after them. After the bye.
I think they can absolutely play with Arizona. They played a tight game with Arizona last year because that's a similar style of Pac-12 spread out ball. UCF and Kansas State are two big-time run games. When you talk, both teams have big-time backs. They got running quarterbacks. We're going to know, I think, in those two games how the rest of Colorado's season is going to go. If they hold up in run defense and they find a way to win one or both of those games, the hype is going to get off the rails. Because to me, again, the key for any team in this Big 12, but especially Colorado with how bad it was last year, is their run defense. The number of stacked – I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even think their first game is a pushover. North Dakota State is really good, second place in the FCS again last year, and they've got a big offensive line and can always run the ball. We're going to know right away what Colorado looks like and their run defense being an X factor for the rest of their season. And then it gets to that last 4 games, and you go, okay, now you're here. Now you have to run the gauntlet, right? Tosh Brooks, Ollie Gordon, Devin Neal's a great back from Kansas. That's what it's going to come down to on top of protecting Shedeur.
Yeah, the run defense was a huge issue last year. I think I noticed it. I'm not even lying to you, Dalton. Week 1 at TCU, I said on my show, I was like, if TCU chose to run the ball, they would have won that game by double figures, because for some reason they kept having Chandler Morris try to test Travis Hunter, and it wasn't working. But I was like, every time they handed it off to Trey Sanders, it was an automatic 6 to 10 yards, and then they stopped doing it. And it's like, oh, I was like, it was a great win. I'm not trying to be the Debbie Downer here, but I was like, that was a very concerning performance from the run defense. But you look at this year's, we'll call it front 7 compared to last year's front 7. There's probably maybe 2 holdovers, I would say. Like Levante Bentley's going to be back starting. Trevor Woods will be back. You can maybe make an argument for Shane Cokes just because he's a leader. He was one of the guys that had the patches on his jersey. But realistically, Colorado's going to be trotting out a whole new whole new defensive line. They have Nikai Hill-Green at linebacker from Charlotte and Michigan, who I think he brings a sense of leadership and sort of just playmaking that they didn't have at linebacker last year. So if this group is able to get things done and you still have the guys from last year sort of fill in as reserves, that's pretty promising. I think last year they just put a lot of guys in compromising situations.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And look, and they were really, really small, right? Even the second half of the year, they were so short on linebackers. They moved Trevor Woods down, and he's 205 pounds. So you just saw, I think what you really just saw isn't so much the fault of Deion or any of that, right? I think he can't fix everything in one off season, right? And the front 7 is the one part he couldn't fix last year. But again, I have to love how much they targeted that in this year's portal cycle, and just directly, there was a clear purpose behind every guy they brought in the portal. And for a lot of them, it was exactly that, is fixing the run defense.
Yeah, this year's portal class to last year's portal class, we talked about it multiple times already. World's different. I say it all the time. Last year's portal class was, hey, I just want new players that weren't here on this 111 team. This year's portal class was, hey, I want to contend. I want to sort of make some noise, because we all know it. I talked about it yesterday when I was talking about the odds of Deion Sanders being fired. He doesn't have too long to sort of figure things out in Colorado just because of how famous he is. If things go bad this year, he's going to be put on the hot seat heading into year 3. Like, that's just how it's going to roll for him. But he knows what he's doing. He knows sort of what he's looking for in a portal guy now, I think we would assume. And so their portal class is very exciting. I think Colorado's contenders, very exciting realistically. And before we move on, can you just talk about, you talked about already, there's 8 to 9 teams that can contend in the Big 12. What does that look like in the sense of Colorado? Like, that doesn't mean they have to go undefeated. Like, it just means they have to beat certain teams certain weeks, right?
Yeah, I think in a highly competitive Big 12, I think 10 wins is the goal, right? I think for any of these teams. And you talk about certain games are going to be massive. I think especially you talk about Kansas State, Arizona, Oklahoma State, who was in the big, they always find themselves in contention, right? Kansas, if Jalen Daniels is healthy all year, is got a really, really good offense and one of the best quarterbacks in the conference. You do have some really big head-to-head matchups, and we're certainly going to be previewing a lot of those games because they're just such big games. But yeah, no, I mean, win 10 games, win the 10 right games, don't lose the wrong games, right? Don't lose that first one in North Dakota State, right? And even to be honest, out of conference, the Nebraska game is going to be massive. It's going to be a really good game. I'm expecting big things out of them too. So that's going to be even more fun than it was last year. It's going to feel like Colorado's playing a big game every week though.
It really is. And I like the point that you made there, that they can't lose to North Dakota State. That's a standalone Thursday night game. So everyone in the country is going to be watching. And while social media shouldn't matter, it's going to matter when you're getting clowned by millions of people Nebraska, rivalry game. At Colorado State, rivalry game. Don't want to lose that one. They have some like personal beef with the Norvell family as the game gets closer. And then not losing the games in the Big 12 that they should. I look at Baylor. I look at Cincinnati. I look at even a game like Texas Tech, right? Where it's like you can't afford to lose on the games where you might be favored or it's going to be really close, because then it makes everything else that much more difficult. When we come back, we're going to be talking about how many wins are Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter worth. Are they Heisman contenders? We're going to be talking about all that up next on Locked on Buffs.